Good afternoon, everybody. Many thanks for this kind introduction. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers, Chris, and all the organizers of this conference, of having invited me to share some of the ideas and some of the research we've been doing in the past and we are currently doing on this, I think, very important topic about language and integration and the kind of policies and its impacts. And this is what I would like to focus on in my presentation. Indeed, as Chris said in the introduction, we recently did a survey where we compared the integration policies of more than 30 countries. This was in cooperation with colleagues from Paris. It was for the Council of Europe. Although for the time being, I'm not entitled to really present real data because we organized, or the Council of Europe organized a conference beginning of June where the findings of that survey will be launched. So maybe some of you will be at that event. I don't know how the invitations work, but there the official data of the 2013 survey will be presented. And after that, I think by the 7th of June, more or less, the report we've written will be available online. But so for the time being, already I can give some information, and I'll do that briefly when I compare some of the older data, the 2008 and 2010 data. But what I'll mainly focus on in today's talk is that first let's briefly stick to these two concepts of language and integration. What do we know about it? What do we know from research about integration issues? What do we know about language? And what are the current policies in relation to that? And then I would like to critically reflect on, do we see any social impact? And I will provide, at least for some of you, some new data. I will present 3 cases. A study we've done in 2012 here in Flanders on the social impact of integration policies, a PhD study that somebody has done in Birmingham in the UK, where he looked at the impact and how people are being prepared within the Yemeni and the Chinese community are being prepared for the language for the UK test. And then finally, I will also refer to the Piet study. And then at the end, I will give you some, what I think are challenges for policy making and for training practices. So first of all, some current trends, things we all know, but I think it's always important to frame what we are talking about and to frame it and to see the kind of policies that have been developed since the turn of the era in what the more global context is we are living in now. We're all aware of the fact that we live in an era of globalization. This is just more than words. Now people more move from one place to the other. We have to redefine, I think, the concept of migration and talk more about mobility, because more and more people becoming mobile. It's easy for us to move from one place to the other. When it's easy for us, it's also very easy for migrants. We know all the examples of people taking cheap Ryanair flights to go on Monday from one place to the other, to work there during the weekend, to go back in the weekend. Now, these things within a European context are things we have to reflect upon when we talk about processes of integration. So, globalization is one thing, these dynamics can't be reversed, and we have to reflect on these when we think of integration policies. At the same time, we see processes of what I call localization, the fact that more and more people live in large cities. My colleague from the Free University in Brussels recently said it. About 100 years ago, there were about 200 million people living in large cities. Nowadays, we're talking about 5 billion people living in large cities. Now, there we have a context of what some people like Steven Vertelek and others call super diversity, where we have an enormous diversity, where people use different languages, where you have a mixture of cultures, where you have mixtures of different social backgrounds. And also that is a challenge when we talk about integration in neighborhoods, in these larger areas, in these larger cities. So we have to reflect on the nationwide driven, the national driven paradigms in terms of integration policies compared to these realities. At the same time, we see, besides the fact there is factual mobility, there is also what I call virtual mobility. The fact that I can Skype with my son when he is abroad, and I can exploit my mother tongue, even when he is living in a country where they speak Arabic or English or what other language, is very convenient for me, and it's even more convenient for my wife when she can Skype with her son, who is 1,000 miles away. But the fact that we exploit these devices means that people in migrant contexts also exploit these devices. So when we talk about time and space in terms of integration processes, we also have to reflect on the fact that others, people in a migrant context, use these devices. It impacts processes of integration. And I think that these things need to be reflected upon in the current policies, or in what I think is needed, new policies that take more into account these current realities. At the same time, we observe an extreme polarization in the debate in many European countries. This is definitely the case in Flanders, and I have to be aware of what I say in this building. But language is an issue in many countries, and it is definitely an issue in Belgium, and specifically in Flanders. What I also observe is that besides that polarization, or as a result of that polarization, there is an enormous binary thinking going on. It is one or the other. There seems to be nothing in between. You are in favor of multilingual education in primary schools, or you are against it. But the fact that realities are always in between these extremes of the binaries are nowadays strongly neglected and ignored, I think. This is, in my view, strongly influenced by, to some extent, I think we are back in the 19th century. And this is, of course, obvious, the fact that in some of our ideological thinking, we go back to the 19th century, because the 20th and especially the 21st century, the nation state as such is extremely under pressure. It is under pressure from above, the fact that there is that process of unification within the EU, where people at the level of the nation state have to question themselves. Is there a future for us? And the same, that dynamics can be observed from below. There is a lot of pressure from regions, from localities, from larger cities on the nation state. Policies that are being developed nowadays at local level, sometimes by contesting national policies or national ideologies. So that ideological thinking, specifically in a context of integration and language, is strongly reflected, in my view, in lots of the current integration policies. Now, what are some of the things we know when it comes to integration on the basis of research? And what is, to a large extent, commonly more and more accepted? And what are things which we often see in at least the first paragraph of each of the integration policies across Europe? Integration is more than a course. It's more than just a language course. It's more than just a course about the knowledge of society. It's more than just a test. It is about equal opportunities. It is about openness. It is about intercultural awareness. It is about reciprocity. Society at large has to take its or their responsibility. So we all agree on these important issues. It has to be inclusive. It has to be dynamic, interactive. We are not open for uniform policies because each group is different, each individual is different. All that discourse is very well known. We are against discrimination. This is the first major issue we have to take into account. We have to address discrimination, so we all agree on that. We also agree on the fact, and research shows that, and we as policymakers also
also accept that idea. It is a longitudinal process. From research, we know that integration processes are intergenerational. We all agree with the fact that social networks are key in these processes of integration, and that it strongly depends on the cultural and social capital people bring with them, and it links to social networks. These are all things we are aware of. There's also a lot of things we know when it comes to languages. We know that people have plurilingual repertoires. Some people talk about translanguaging, and I'll come back to that concept a bit later, but although that's a bit more difficult to accept, sometimes I say, and this is hard to accept as an idea, but sometimes I say that languages as such do not exist. Languages are invented by people. I mean, languages are social constructs to a large extent. I mean, the fact that there is something like Standard Dutch is invented. There are different repertoires within the Dutch language. There is school language, there is the language of the street, there is the language of work. So there are different repertoires within a language. But we start, at least bit by bit, to accept that we have to be careful in thinking in terms of languages as compartmentalized units. People in reality translanguage all the time. We exploit different repertoires when we interact, when we communicate. This is specifically the case. This is the case for all of us. I mean, I'm sure that all of you, during all these days that you've been here, you've been translanguaging all the time. You've been shifting from one repertoire to the other, between the standard language and the dialects, between one language and another, and this is normal behavior. So there's nothing abnormal when you shift between languages. Migrants living in larger cities, where you have an enormous amount of different languages together, they mingle as well. There also translanguaging is going on. So to some extent we accept that. We agree with the fact that linguistic capital is very important. We accept the fact that language learning is just more than learning a language in a formal context. We are humble. I hope we are humble on that. And we provide training that language acquisition processes not only depend on us, fortunately. And we also accept and know that there is something like explicit and implicit learning, intentional and incidental learning. We all agree and accept that we learn in context. I always say, if we stick to extreme 19th century traditional approaches of language learning, where you first learn lists of vocabulary and in certain in certain specific themes, and then we think that that knowledge is transferred automatically into performance. It's a naive way of thinking, so we accept that languages are learned in context, that it is needs related, that it is longitudinal, that language acquisition processes are whimsical, that they are not linear, that they are individually different, that interaction is key in language learning processes. If teachers talk if a lesson takes 15 minutes and the teacher talks 40 minutes of that time, there's hardly any language learning going on. We know that, I hope. And we learn in contact. Good. If we know all that, now what have the current integration policies learned from this? And here it becomes interesting. What are the main official aims? People have to learn the language. It has to be a precondition. It has to, only when they know the language, the standard variety of the language, not any language, only the standard variety, it will facilitate the process of integration. It will strengthen social cohesion and social participation. It will increase the access to the labor market and further education. It is a strong, important lever to become a citizen of the nation. That's why, for instance, in Flanders and in the Netherlands, we call it inburgering, becoming a citizen of the country. I tend to call it moral citizenship, but this is not. So language in all this is definitely seen as the main movement and extremely pivotal in all show you some data of surveys we've done over time. The first survey we've done was in 2002. It was with ALTE. Some of you know ALTE is the Association of Language Testers in Europe. In those days, in 2002, we did a first survey where we looked at the policies in 14 countries. What we saw was that more or less 29% of these countries had a language requirement in one way or another, mainly focusing on issues of citizenship. This is 2002. 5 years later, with ALTE, we did the second survey. And it's interesting to see that over 5 years' time, the countries that had language requirements as part of their integration policies increased to more or less 60%. And I can tell you that that's after the panel discussion. I can tell you fantastic anecdotes of people who put lots of pressure from one country to the other in order to increase their levels of proficiency, in order to be less lenient. I mean, very nice examples, but of course I have to be careful to whom I say what. In 2008, the Council of Europe took over that work, that specific work of ALTE, and we did a year later, we did a new survey where we had the opportunity to involve more countries there. We had data of about 7 countries, and there in 1 year's time we saw that it increased almost to 3/4 of the countries who had language requirements in one way or another. The survey before last one, the 2010 survey, we also there saw an increase up to 75%. What I can tell you about the 2013 data is that there is hardly any increase anymore. This is, of course, understandable in the sense that when already 3/4 of the country do have policies in one or language requirements in one way or another, there is little space anymore left for some increase. So more or less the same percentage of countries in 2013 who have language requirements. There are no countries who stopped their language and integration policy or whatsoever. What we saw was that in 2013, some of the countries have increased, specifically the countries who had rather lenient policies in terms of CFR levels. In some of these countries in 2013, we saw that they increased their level, for instance, from A1 up to A2 or from A2 up to B1. So that kind of hiring the conditions is a trend that we observe in the 2013 data. What we also see is that in the majority, what you can see here from the data, is that in the majority of countries, both in 2008 and 2010, and this picture is supported with the 2013 data, is that it is mainly for citizenship that the majority of the countries do have language conditions. This is to a large extent the case in Eastern European countries. Still in 2013, mainly Eastern European countries do have policies for citizenship, and this is historically, can be explained from historical reasons. In Western European countries, there is also a lot of emphasis on, in 2008, 2010, and 2013, on language requirements for citizenship, but still there, compared to Eastern European countries, in the Western European countries, there is more emphasis than in others on language conditions and integration policies for permanent residency. And we also see a slight increase, or we saw a slight increase from 2008 to 2010 for countries who have language conditions prior to entry, so conditions in the host country. There were no real major changes as for policies prior to entry. Still about 6 countries do have. What we do see is that some countries do have a minor, not in terms of conditions, in terms of a language test or language course that needs to be taken in the country of origin, but for instance, like Flanders is an example where leaflets have been developed and that are at the embassies in the different countries, like for instance in Turkey, and when people
think of migrating to Belgium and they go to the embassy, then they get a leaflet with information about the knowledge and the norms and the values of the Flemish society. So but the major changes in policies could be seen from 2002 to 2008, 2008 to 2010, and now it seems to be stagnating more. So what we see is that in that shift from 2008 to 2010, we see that slightly more countries have language and knowledge of society requirements. We saw that some countries who didn't have any policy in 2008 were very much under pressure and were in the process of developing a policy and have developed a policy in 2010. Some countries who hadn't yet developed it in 2010 but who provided us information in the survey that they were planning to, did it indeed between 2010 and 2013. And as I already said, there is a difference between, to some extent, the focus and the trends in Western European countries versus Eastern European countries. Whatever that division, I know that is very trivial to make that kind of divisions, whatever that division means. What is, I think, important, what remains in the 2010 data and also in the 2013 data, although there is a lot of emphasis by all of you and by others on the importance of quality is key within this project, what we see is that there is still a large variation across and among countries in terms of regulations and conditions, the costs. In some countries people don't have to pay anything, in other countries it can be extremely expensive. The language proficiency levels required, in some cases it varies between A2 and B2, for some cases between A1 and B2, so there are major differences. There's also major differences when it comes to sanctions and also in hours of tuition. And this is, in my view, always the most intriguing. In some countries people can get an A2 level in a certain amount of hours, and in other countries it's 10 times that amount. So that as such would be an interesting research project, how these hours of tuition have been calculated. But these are intriguing issues when it comes to the fact that there is to some extent a freedom of mobility for people within a European context. When there is that variation, then people who want to migrate to Europe might reflect on, okay, which of the countries is the most lenient one? And there are interesting, one anecdote I can tell you is that it was around 2004 that the Dutch government had a stricter policy than the Belgian government. There were no language tests in Flanders or whatsoever. In the Netherlands there were strict conditions. There were no conditions prior to entry. And in the Netherlands that was to a large extent to reduce the number of marriages of Turkish second and third generation youngsters with people from the home country. And the Minister of Integration in the Netherlands in those days explicitly wanted to reduce that number of marriages, and that's why she developed that policy. Now what we saw was that what is known as the Belgian route in those days, people married in Turkey and they first lived for a couple of years in Antwerp, which is not that far from the Dutch border, and then after a couple of years they went back to the Netherlands. And that's why there is a lot of pressure going on between the different countries. And so these are things. I think we have to be aware of the fact, and to some extent frame these policies, these trends within what I would like to call, as I referred in the beginning of my talk, what I would like to call a context of our 19th century ideas of the fact that language is key to keep the nation together. I mean, we had in the 19th century the old romantic Herderian idea of the flag, the hymn, and the language that creates the nation. Also, that are social constructs, hard to accept sometimes, but they are. But they are built on our ideological way of thinking
We are all convinced that the norm should be, or is, in many cases, monolingualism. While, if we look into the mirror, we all know that except for a few people in Papua New Guinea, we are all multilingual. But that ideology, that set of beliefs, as you can see on the slide, that set of beliefs about the role of language in culture, social, political contexts, and the fact that these ideologies are anchored in such concepts are deeply rooted. Bourdieu, the French sociologist, called that the doxa. It is so deeply rooted, so commonsensical, that, and these ideologies, these monolingual beliefs, strongly influence our thinking, our policy making. These ideologies impact our policies, so we have to be aware of the fact that the language policy is never neutral. It is never objective. These policies are made by human beings, and these are made on the basis of a social frame in which they function. It is built on these people's beliefs. So, in many cases, these policies have to legitimize ideological choices. I'm not going to bother you with the issues of multilingualism in our schools in Flanders, but I can tell you that recently there was a very interactive debate in the newspapers going on, where people are strongly convinced that banning the mother tongue of Turkish children in the school is in favor of these kids. This is highly ideological driven, but I'll come back to that in a minute. Language policies are extremely powerful instruments, and they are often implemented through curricula, training modules, language tests, and programs. So we have to be aware, and we have to be aware of the fact that there is such a thing like our monolingual beliefs that impact our policy making. Now the interesting thing is, and this is an example I'd like to give you, it is not in adult education, it is in secondary education, but it's from a study we finished recently, where we gathered data of teachers' beliefs. And I'm showing you these data just to give you an idea how policies impact beliefs and what the impact of beliefs are of what goes on in the reality, in this context, the reality of the school. The policy in most schools in Flanders is only Dutch. In most of the schools, in the school regulations, it clearly says that the only language which is allowed to be used in the school is Dutch. In many cases, children are punished. There are examples that the children get stickers when they are tapped that they speak another language than Dutch. This gives you an idea of the beliefs of teachers in secondary schools in Flanders. We gave them assertions, and they had to score on a Likert scale, on a 1 to 5 Likert scale. What we see is that, for instance, the first assertion, non-Dutch speaking pupils should not be allowed to speak their own language at school. Almost 4 or 5 teachers agree with that statement. Another one which is interesting, the most important cause of academic failure of non-Dutch speaking pupils is their insufficient proficiency in Dutch. 80% more. 8. It is in the interest of the pupils when they are punished for speaking their own language at school. 3 out of 10 teachers agree with that.
Sad teachers.
Sorry?
Very sad teachers.
Very sad. Yeah, well, let me show you the next one. Now I have to get rid of my jacket. Good. Now this is something sad. What we did was, we had data of trust that teachers have in their pupils, also through a questionnaire. We correlated the x-axis is the monolingual beliefs of teachers. Score 5 is highly monolingual beliefs. Score 1 is are teachers who think more multilingually. You see the dots are teachers, and you see, as I already showed, the majority of teachers think rather monolingual. Their beliefs are rather monolingual. The vertical axis is the trust teachers have in their pupils. A 1 score is low trust. A high score, 5, is high trust. What you see is a negative correlation. The more monolingual we think, the least trust we have in our pupils. So, now this is an interesting finding, I think. Whether it's sad or not.
You have to do something.
Well, you're absolutely right there. But I'm afraid that we are not the only one, to be honest. Some of these data are rather universal. They are absolutely extreme in Flanders, and this can be historically explained, absolutely. But that correlation between the more monolingual you think, the least trust you have, is unfortunately a very universal finding, and can be found not only with languages, but also if you do not believe there's this massive amount of other research besides languages. But if you do not believe in your child, you won't trust them, and the fact that you don't trust them impacts your expectations. And if you have low expectations, it'll impact outcomes. And that's why it shouldn't surprise, for those of you who are familiar with PISA data, it shouldn't surprise that we often see these variations in outcomes on the PISA data. So what this example shows is that we actually realize the opposite of the policies that schools opt for. Schools with the best intentions opt for a monolingual policy. They are convinced of the fact that such a monolingual policy is in favor of their language acquisition of Dutch, that will improve their outcomes, both cognitively and non-cognitively. What we see is that the opposite happens, that it has negative effects. And my claim is, and I'll try to show that with 3 examples in a minute, is that the same holds to a large extent for integration policies. The more it is conditional, the more it is triggered by our monolingual thinking, the more it is triggered by our thinking in terms of a society is a coherent group of people living together, sharing the same language and the same values, is an extreme naive idea. Of course, we all agree on that. But the more we want to convince others of that idea, and the more we want to transfer that into policies, the more it'll have negative impacts on what we actually want to realize, which is a multicultural society where we really help people in acquiring languages. So 3 studies. One is a social impact study we've done in 2011 and 2012 on the integration policies in Flanders. An interesting study, a PhD study from Kamaran Khan, where he did an anthropological study in the Yemen community and in the Chinese community in Birmingham, and then some interesting data from Piet. I know you're all aware, you are all familiar with the Piet data, and I'm sure that those who are familiar, you know the figures by heart for the whole country. Good. What were some of the salient findings of the impact study we did in Flanders? As I said, reciprocity was strongly emphasized in all the documents we've analyzed in the Flemish context. As I said, as in many other countries. However, that two-way process, the reciprocal process, is nearly less explicit in the practical enrollment of the policy in Flanders. Only the perspective of the migrant is emphasized in a conditional and in an obligatory discourse. There is hardly anything or nothing on the role of the receiving society. What is the role of the receiving society? Well, those who are interested in that, very interested in literature, is the Dutch sociologist Willem Schinkel, who is very critical, even more than I am, on these issues of integration. So this is what we saw. Yes, interesting discourse supporting the idea of reciprocity, the fact that the inviting society has a role to play, but when you look at the real practices of the policy, there are only action plans at the level of the migrant. What we wanted to know is to what extent the society at large, and we did an online survey, in different domains. One in social welfare, employers, the population at large, local authorities, and education. I'm not going to give you all the data, but just this one. These data were gathered in 2012. When did we have our first policy in Flanders? Was it around 2000, end of the 90s? Then we had our first policy. So we are talking about more or less 10, 15 years. One would suspect, hope, that at least in terms of the attitudes that it have had such an integration policies would have an impact on the people's attitudes towards migrants who volunteered, who were active, who participated, who did the language courses, who tried to interact with people, and who after the course unfortunately come to a lot of you who work here in Flemish schools saying, I can't practice my Dutch, I find it hard to build up social networks. Now, what about these attitudes? The darker the color, the more positive. What we see when we look at employers, only, so you have to, 7% of the employers have a positive attitude towards migrants who participate in an integration program after 10 to 15 years. People in education, 9% have a positive attitude. This is about social impact. This is about what is the impact of these integration policies. Because these were the assumptions. It will lead to more social participation. It will increase social cohesion. That was the reason why we invented all these policies. The fact that there were complaints by society at large that migrants didn't want to integrate. That there was an unwillingness after so many years. People at the municipalities, local administrators, 4%. They are actively involved in these policies. People in the welfare sector, 14%. I think these are things we have to be concerned about. Because when we talk about impact of policies, we mainly look how many people did participate in the course, how many people were successful on the tests. This is all interesting, but this is not about impact. It only says something about the willingness of migrants to participate and to be successful on the test. It says nothing on the society at large. Good. Becoming British, a migrant's journey is the PhD study done by Cameron Khan. If you're interested, I have the online version, I can send it to you, it's magnificently written. It's an anthropological study. For 11 months, he was actively involved of one person, and he really almost slept with that person from the Yemeni community. He even at a certain point, and I think it's even in his text, he had cat sessions where he chewed cats in order to, at least as an anthropologist, you have to do that, to get an idea of what they're thinking with, even when you are in other spaces. Good. Now, I'm not an expert on the integration policy in the UK. I'm sure there are people from the UK here who have much more expertise than I have, but what I know is that there is something which is called the language for the UK test. Now, what he did was he wanted to have an idea how these people are being prepared for this language in the UK test. Good. What is the definition of the construct? The idea is, and I quote from the NIA 2002 report, legislation that requires migrants to demonstrate a sufficient knowledge of English and a sufficient knowledge about life in the UK. The test, and this is important, the test covers both the sufficient knowledge of English and the sufficient knowledge about life in the UK requirements. So the construct and the test are focusing at CRVAR at the P1 level as being sufficient, but language is not tested separately. It is tested in an integrated way, which makes sense. The thing I strongly support. If you have a test about the knowledge of society, you want to test at the same time P1 level. Why bother people with two tests if you can do it in one test? Now, what are the practices? And here I will have to read you a bit through some interesting interactions. It is Khan who did the interview, the PhD student who did the interview. The interview took its pseudonym of a Chinese ESOL tutor about the techniques to prepare the Chinese test takers. And Tuk begins by saying, basically, like what you mentioned about the Arabic speaker, that's the other person that wrote in the anthropological study of Khan. Right, yeah, translate everything. I actually have it in here. I basically did English, I did Chinese. There's two parts. The idea of there's English, there's Chinese on one part of the paper, and there's English on the other part of the paper. On this side, Chinese on this side, and then they found the keywords. The basic idea is that the information is basically Chinese, and out of that they have English, and they try to distinguish keywords that are in the questions in the language for the UK test, and that are in the distractors in the multiple choice test. So, for these people, they are not familiar with it, so I tell them a story, like a story. In Chinese, yes, in Chinese first, in Mandarin, yes, in Mandarin, and then you remember a letter, and after that, a little list with keywords, always keywords, learning the keywords by heart. And then, here at the bottom, yes, it goes to audio, because the exam actually you can also listen. So yes, you listen to the audio bits, and oh yes, these two words normally go together. And for language learners, actually, if you look at our way of learning a song, you don't have to sit down and learn a new song. You just listen, and you become familiar with the keywords. And that's the way it works. So what you see is that actually, the people who prepare these people for such a test, that they use interesting cognitive strategies to translate the language from the UK test and to make it accessible for learners. Now, what I find the most intriguing thing is that they exploit the multilingual repertoires in order to do something with English. What they do with English is another question, but at least they exploit the multilingual repertoires. Now, Tuk also reduces the cognitive load for these people, because many of them are illiterate or low literate, they have low education backgrounds, and they often narrow it down, or they narrow the curriculum to, let's say, learning these keywords. And then look in the distractors, keyword, yes, these keywords go together, that will probably be the answer. And that's how they guess. So, Tuk knows that they may not understand sentence structures, that they know when they can combine all these words, women vote rights, check, and that will probably be the positive answer. Women have the right to vote. These kind of things. So all this undermines the whole idea of B1 as a level that the language for the UK test should be aimed at. What does this mean in terms of social impact? Can we blame the migrants for the fact that we prepare them? If we put conditions, we act according to conditions. At least that's what I did as a student. When the exam was easy, when there were escape routes, I definitely went for the escape route. Why not? So this is when you develop policies which start from such a conditional perspective, perspective, we will always look for opportunities in order to take the easiest route to be successful. Because that's what we see. It is the majority of people are successful on the language of the UK test. And they have to pass, the maximum score is 24 and the cutoff is 18. So which is a high score? It's not just 50%. Good. Third example. This is for those who have perfect eyes. Right. I leave the PowerPoint behind then, and I mean, you can put the PowerPoint on the website, so then you can review it in detail. What you see here is, this is the average score for literacy, for reading, so not for numeracy, but for literacy. What is the average score for native-born and native language people? Me for Dutch. As far as I know, I am not from a migrant background. This is the score for native-born foreign language. Second, third generation migrants. Right? This is the score for foreign-born foreign language. People who came into the country less than 5 years ago. These people are people mainly who are not involved in language integration policies and in obligatory language programs. What we see is that their score is more or less the same. There is no significant difference between me and second, third generation migrants. There is indeed a major difference between those who recently arrived and second, third generation. That shouldn't surprise, of course. But what it proves is that whatever policy you take, it just takes time. Integration is a process that takes time. Numeracy, acquiring the language, is also a process which takes time. I do not have this slide here. I used that already many times at other occasions, but Ilana Shohami is one of the people who already clearly showed that it takes at least 9 to 12 years for a person to come more or less at the level of language proficiency which is close to the average. And then I'm talking, or Ilana is talking about higher educated people, people with a higher educated background. Even after 9, 10 years, people from lower educated background do not reach that level. Because language learning are slow processes. But this is hard nowadays in a time of evidence-based and where everything has to be effective. This is very hard to accept. For those in Flanders who are interested, same for the Flemish data, but that is just one in Flanders. Good. Challenges. First of all, I think, and this is not only a plea to policymakers, but to all of us, I strongly think we have to change the discourse. The more we maintain the discourse of blaming the victim, saying that people are unwilling to integrate, are unwilling to participate in a multicultural society in extreme diverse neighborhoods, is ignoring what in reality is going on in many of these neighborhoods. There are indeed neighborhoods where it's hard to live, but there are also major, fantastic examples of things that are going on in certain neighborhoods. But it'll have to be monitored. It not always goes by itself or evolves by itself. But we have to change the discourse from language as problem and a person only seeing a migrant as, oh, you're a migrant, oh my goodness, that's only problems. I mean, like a colleague of mine who often is addressed, oh, your Dutch isn't bad at all. That says it. We have to change it to pluralism, richness and opportunities in locality. I strongly think we have to change our policies, building on the things of what we know from research, building on the things that I said from the beginning. We have to develop policies that work at local level, because every locality
about research that has been done in Australia, where two Hungarian groups have been compared, one in a more open society, a multicultural society, the other group in the 60s in a more closed society. This is a cliffhanger. We have to change our teaching. We all agree on a lot of these issues, but we are stubborn. And we are stubborn in the sense that we are used to work in a certain way. And it takes energy, and that's very legitimate, but it takes energy to change. But I think it is needed. We have to. Although we all agree, I still do not see enough language courses and training programs that really start from the needs of groups. And these needs vary across individuals. They vary across groups. The fact is, when you start from these needs and you link that to the common European framework, you will come up with completely different descriptors than the descriptors which we have now in our A1, A2 courses. But that's another story, but we completely misuse the CRR. We have to move to new pedagogies. What I think is our teaching has to be much more task-based, much more cooperative, and much more finding the balance between formal and informal learning. Still, too many of our teaching time, it is us who speak, and now and then doing some activities and exercises. There is no learning going on, I already said that. Our courses need to be more tailor-made, and we have to professionalize and support our teachers in that. We have to increase their knowledge about L2 teaching. There's a lot of current, recent, interesting research that goes on in that area of L2 and SLA. This is not transferred into the classroom practice. This is not often transferred into the knowledge of and into the hands of the teacher. We have to give them the competencies to deal with diversity. We have, as a teacher, tried to move beyond our own frame of reference. What I think is right or wrong, we have to try to move beyond that. We have to provide teachers with more examples of good practice. We have to give them support on how to identify the needs. This is what I often hear from the teachers, and this is a legitimate cry. The fact, yeah, I agree with the fact that I have to start from their needs, but how do I do that? How do I transfer that in practice? How do I organize that? How do we organize that as a school? Support is much more needed there. We have to dare to go beyond the traditional boundaries, I think, as a school, as an institute, as an individual teacher. And teachers have to be coached much more than we do now. We also have to strongly, I think, change the assessment. We focus too much on what people can't instead of what they can. This is the heart of testing and of language testing. And I think specifically in this context, what if we start our integration policies, our language courses, our assessment procedures from what people can in terms of language repertoires and build on that instead of the fact that we see them in our classes as having zero language and only focusing on the target language. And this is definitely the case in the area of assessment. As I said, we accept the fact and we exploit in our classes the multilingual repertoires of the students. Students are allowed to help each other to explain in different languages in the learning process. So we experiment with that. It's a reality in time, in space. It is accepted as a pedagogy, that idea of translanguaging. Those who are not familiar with that concept as translanguaging, I would kindly refer to Ophelia Garcia. She's from New York University, and in 2009 she wrote an extremely interesting article on translanguaging. So there is also empirical evidence. But what about multilingual assessment? What, for integration purposes, if a Turkish migrant here in Flanders is capable of writing a piece of text where he writes and exploits all his repertoires with bits and pieces of Dutch, and now and then a word of Turkish, and maybe a word of French and a word of English,
when he can and tries to express himself or herself, it's not there in assessment. We punish people. We punish people when they use certain strategies to get their message across in their communication. This is in education at large, and definitely also in our case. Our assessment practices are modeling, and this is, of course, obvious, because our teaching is modeling. It disfavors minorities. It disfavors immigrants. It shouldn't surprise that in PISA, for instance, migrants by definition do worse than non-migrants, because they have another mother tongue. I mean, Kathleen Duke has done interesting research in South Africa, and Shahami in Tel Aviv, and Kate Mencken in the US, where they developed the PISA tests in the mother tongue of these kids for maths, for instance, and their performances were much higher than when it was in the second language. So there are interesting experiments. We have to change our trajectories and the trajectories that people have to go through. Integration policies, as I said, is more than a knowledge of society and a language and an L2 course. It involves, I think it is important that we as teachers or people in the training, the teaching training industry, are getting more involved or willing to be more involved in the whole process of integration. If we are just seeing ourselves as, look, if we accept that integration is a path people have to go through, a lifelong path, and if we only accept that we are there for 8 weeks or 20 weeks, and then our role is finished, I think this is not the way to go for when it comes to trying to build trajectories in supporting people in their process of integration. We have to link that to education achievements with further education. And I know a lot of experiments are already going on in many European countries, but we have to move and to go into that much more than we do now. We have to support people in building social networks. There are too many migrants in Flanders, and I can only speak for research here in Flanders, who afterwards come to us and say, 20 weeks of Dutch, I try to contact people, try to speak to people. Nobody wants. In the apartment block where I live, people ignore me. I think there we all have a responsibility. So we have to involve much more, I think, as a society at large, not only policy. And I think we have a role there as well. We have to involve the receiving society in the process. We have to accept how integration policies really take place and that they vary across individuals, and we have to adapt our policies accordingly. We also have to accept how language acquisition really takes place. Not only seeing language acquisition processes from that formal perspective of what we think for decades what the best approach for language teaching is. We have to accept that how that language acquisition processes really takes place and adapt our teaching. As I said, formal, informal, explicit, implicit, and we have to adapt them to these realities. As I've already stressed as well, we have to accept the assessment as an inclusive part of language and integration. When in the Netherlands people have to find on the market their own language programs, and it's up to them to acquire the language, and the only thing in the policy is that they have to do a test, I find that from a ethical perspective completely unacceptable. Then you do not take up your role as a society. We have to change the current policies towards an inclusive, a facilitating, a dynamic, a longitudinal and an interactive process in which every individual has a responsibility. So language and integration policies, in order to have real social impact, will need to sensitize, and I can't stress that enough, but we need to sensitize the society at large, not only about its role in integration programs, but also in shaping, in creating a society that manages to deal with diversity from a more positive perspective, that we grapple with discrimination in education and the workplace. I haven't stressed that, but many migrants complain about the fact that they have less opportunities on the job market. When 70%, 70% of the Turkish and Moroccan migrants in Flanders are nowadays in vocational schools, this is discrimination in the educational system of Flanders. The same for job market. We have at the same time gravity discrimination, that this is harmful for society. And we have to embrace and foster the multicultural realities both in space and time. Because I think, ladies and gentlemen, that for diversity is the moon and the challenge will be